Hey there, welcome to another episode of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is all the new action figures I've acquired for the past few weeks. It's about mid-January right now, and I haven't really posted a video like this in nearly a month or so because the last couple of weeks of December, anything I bought for myself, I didn't open, so I couldn't really show you guys. I set it aside and kind of gave it to myself for Christmas. And then after the holidays, I posted my best of 2019 list where I showed you what I felt were the top 19 action figures that I added to my collection in 2019. And I recommend you go check out that video if you haven't already. So yeah, I bought quite a few things for myself in the last couple of weeks of December. You know, I was out there doing a lot of shopping for others, and every time I went out, I seemed to find something for myself too. So we'll take a look at all that stuff. And I've also picked up a few things the first couple weeks of January of 2020 as well. So it's actually quite a bit of stuff. So I won't waste too much more time here with the intro. We'll dive right into it. So I want to start by showing you the coolest new thing I've got. But before I can show it to you, it requires a little bit of background. So what you're looking at here are two of the original G.I. Joes from the original 1982 toy line. So this here is Snake Eyes, who is the well-known G.I. Joe ninja / commando. And this is my original one from when I was a kid. Now you'll notice his arms are a little weird looking. That's because I broke his original thumbs off. And so my dad helped me replace his arms with some Cobra Commander arms, and we painted them black so they'd match, but a lot of that black is rubbed off. Anyway, he is he's very wobbly. Just touching him, he's very delicate. I'm worried he's going to fall apart just by touching him. But that's Snake Eyes. And beside him is Flash. So this figure is also from 1982. The reason he's standing so weird is because he's also basically ready to fall apart. He's so loose and wobbly right now. This figure isn't from my childhood, but I acquired it sometime later. But he was the G.I. Joe team's laser trooper. So as a kid, I collected G.I. Joe from 1982 right up till about 1990. And then the toy line fizzled out in 94. There was a couple little false starts, a couple of figures, a couple changes in size and articulation, things that were not really geared towards me anymore. I was drawn back into G.I. Joe in 2002 when Hasbro relaunched the Real American Hero brand of G.I. Joe that I grew up with brand new figures and brand new molds. And I was at that time I was in my early 20s. I had some disposable income. I always loved G.I. Joe. I just kind of felt it had grown away from what I liked as a kid. But around 2002, I was ready to dive back in. And one of the funnest things about those early years as an adult collector was now we had the internet, which didn't exist when I was a kid. And you found out about all these variations of G.I. Joes that you didn't even know existed, such as international action figures. So what you see here, this is a guide I had purchased that talks about international G.I. Joes from various countries. So you'll see here, I'm looking at a page from Argentina, and it's got a repainted Scarlet, who they called Glenda, a repainted Stalker, who they called Manla. And yeah, we had no idea that these figures existed. It was really cool. So some of these international figures, once collectors learned about them, they became quite valuable. If you look at the price of these guys, what they were valued at, to be mint in package, Cobra Mortal was valued at $3,750. Same as Manla. Glenda was $2,300. And this book here is from 2004. So these values, I'm sure, have gone up quite a bit since then. And even though I was fascinated by a lot of these international G.I. Joes, the one I was most fascinated by was this guy here on the cover, Cobra Diaco. So this figure was from Brazil, and what he is Snake Eyes' head, except chromed up like Destro, and then he was on Flash, the laser trooper's body, except instead of red pads on an olive green uniform, he had yellow pads on black uniform. Plus, both those characters were good guys on G.I. Joe, but this character here, he's a bad guy, and he's got the Cobra logo on his chest. And I just thought this thing was super cool. if we look him up on the Brazil pages in this guide, you'll see here that Cobra Diaco was valued at $2,500 if he was mint in package at the time, and it talks about how he's a very desirable international collector piece. And this thing here, even though I thought he was super cool, I knew I would never own this figure. He was simply too rare and too expensive. So even though I was really excited about the 2002 relaunch of G.I. Joe, some of those figures were still pretty wonky looking and they had some pretty bad proportions. The modern era of G.I. Joe really kicked off in 2007 when Hasbro launched what they initially called the 25th anniversary line of G.I. Joes. So you can see here, this is the 25th version of Snake Eyes and the 25th anniversary version of Flash. So they're based on the original figures from 1982, but they are constructed differently and they have a lot more detail and increased articulation. So for example, these old figures, they're always falling apart because they were held together by this little rubber elastic inside of them there. And over time, those elastics have deteriorated into nothing. But with these new figures, there's no washer inside. The articulation is much better. The figures stay stiffer, longer. Like this guy, considering he's from 2007, he's quite a few years old now, and there's no loose joints or anything like that. They're just in much better constructed than the vintage figures, and like I said, a little taller, a little more detailed. And yeah, these things are great. So, the G.I. Joe Collectors Club in 2011, they did a convention set called Mission Brazil, which the storyline was some G.I. Joes had to go down to Brazil to fight some Cobra Troopers, and those Cobra Troopers were being led by a Cobra associate known as Steel Cobra. So the Collectors Club changed Cobra Diaco's name to make it a little, I think, easier to say for American audiences, but they did the exact same formula as the vintage one. They took the head of the modern Snake Eyes, you can see it there, and they took the body of the modern Flash, and they just chromed the head and repainted the body. He still has the same laser pack and weapon as Flash, just like the vintage figure did. And there we go. We got a modern version of Cobra Diaco. Now this figure here, because it was part of a convention set, it was still very expensive and very sought after. These convention sets, which they release every year, they were comprised of 15 figures, and they were primarily only available for sale if you attended the convention, and then there'd be a limited number of sets available to non-attendees that could purchase online. But these box sets sold for about $500. And if you only wanted one figure, you'd have to turn to eBay or something, and people would break up their sets and sell the figures for like $100 a piece or more. So this version of Cobra Diaco, even though it's only from 2011, he was still over $100 to acquire. And fortunately, I had an awesome girlfriend at the time, who is now my awesome wife, and she bought this for me for my birthday in 2012. And it's one of my favorite G.I. Joe figures in my collection, partly because I've always been kind of fascinated with Cobra Diaco ever since I first learned about him in the early 2000s. I think he's just got a really cool look, very striking outfit. I love the chrome head. So yeah, it was just really cool to finally get a version of this character in my collection. So while Hasbro was producing these modern era G.I. Joes, there was also some, I don't know if you want to call them black market G.I. Joes being released as well. So here's an example. This is a vintage style G.I. Joe figure, but this was not officially released by Hasbro. This was produced by a guy known as the Black Major, who takes vintage G.I. Joe molds and repaints them and creates like new variations of classic characters. So yeah, this is a Cobra Trooper in like a Tiger Force outfit, and he's got dozens and dozens of variations. Now, one of the variations that I picked up from him that I was very excited to acquire was this version. I don't know if they necessarily called him Cobra Diaco or Steel Cobra or whatever, but clearly it's the vintage Flash body with the vintage Snake Eyes head, chromed up, except this guy here, obviously his uniform is a little different. It's white with red pads, and you'll see his Cobra logo is in a Canadian maple leaf. So me being a Canadian collector, this was something I really wanted to get. And because these are, kind of bootlegged and made to order, they're not even all that expensive. Each one of these figures is maybe about $20 or so. However, as cool as the Canadian one was, I still really wanted a reproduction of the vintage Cobra Diaco. And one of these, I found somebody online that was selling a Black Major figure. And so I bought it, and it arrived in the mail. And if you've watched my prior videos, you probably seen me talk about this one because it wasn't even that long ago. But here he is. And you'll notice something's not quite right. So the body is exactly what the vintage Cobra Diaco would have looked like, except the chrome Snake Eyes head, it came in a separate bag. And I don't know if this vendor thought he was doing me a favor by providing me with this extra kind of Cobra pilot head. But I had no interest in this Cobra pilot head, so I wanted to immediately take it off and put on the chrome head. Unfortunately, the screw in the back, which is the only way to really get his head off, is totally stripped. I could not get to it at all. So I paid this money for this figure, which I really have no interest in. I don't really like displaying him like this. And so I don't have the vintage version of Cobra Diaco like I wanted. And so I'm hoping eventually I'll have to take a drill to this guy and maybe break the screw so I can put the head on properly. But until I get around to doing that, I've been kind of bummed that I don't have this vintage version of Cobra Diaco. So now, after that long-winded introduction, I can finally show you the new piece that I've added to my collection. And this is a reproduction of the vintage Cobra Diaco on a reproduced card and everything. So Vanessa got me this for Christmas, and I think it is amazing. So you see there, this is exactly what the figure would have looked like in Brazil back in the 80s. That chrome head, the flash body. He's got the laser gun. He's got the laser pack. Even the artwork, which is, kind of bad artwork, is reproduced exactly. It's even got, I haven't punched it, but there's a little punch card there. It's got all the Brazilian language, the file card as well. It's, it's awesome. Love it. So if you see that guidebook that I have there from the early 2000s, you'll see here that this package looks exactly like the original Brazilian package, right down to the logo. And I think it's amazing. It still kind of bothers me that I don't have one of these that I can actually kind of play around with, because there's no way I'm going to open this. This guy's going to get pinned to the wall and be an awesome display piece. The only sad thing about it is everybody that comes into my man cave to check things out, I don't know if anybody I know or will ever know will appreciate the cool factor of this thing here. But as long as I know, that's what matters. So there you go. That's Cobra Diaco from Vanessa. One of the best gifts ever. And just awesome. Now, Vanessa really spoiled me for Christmas this year, but most of the stuff she got me was practical things that you guys don't really need to see, like a new jacket and a sweater and that sort of stuff. But this is another little fun thing she bought me that was just a little stocking stuffer. It is an Alien Emperor puzzle cube. And we spotted these together at a little store that her mom works at, and I pointed out how they were kind of cute. So you see here, this is a difficulty level 4, apparently. There were 4 different ones to choose from, so this is the hardest one. But level 1 was like an astronaut, level 2 was a robot, and level 3 was an alien or something. Anyway, so she bought me the level 4, and the idea is you take this guy who is clearly inspired by Brainiac from Superman comic books, and you turn him into a cube. So here's my evil alien emperor outside of the box. And I suppose if you really wanted to, you could kind of just use him as an action figure. He's got some kind of articulation. And I've had him for a couple weeks now. I have not yet attempted to turn him into a box. So let's see if I can do that. I don't have the patience for this right now, and I don't expect you to either, so that's as QB as he's going to get for the time being. So before I move on to showing you my other new action figures, I do want to just quickly show you another cool gift that Vanessa bought for me for Christmas. And this is a mounted poster from the fictional movie from the show The Office. So you've got Threat Level Midnight with Michael Scarn and Golden Face and the robot butler. So yeah, this is pretty awesome. And yeah, so there you go. Threat Level Midnight. So here is a new Black Panther figure I got. This is just a couple of quick shots of him in the packaging, but now let's open him up and take a look. So here is my new Black Panther figure. You might have noticed when I was showing you some pictures of him in the packaging that there was a sticker on the front that said exclusive to Walmart. So that's where this guy comes from. Now, I've actually only seen him at Walmart once before, and it was several months ago. And I saw it, and it wasn't worth $30 to me, although I gotta admit, I thought it was really cool looking. I don't really know why. There isn't really a precedent for this look, as far as I know. Black Panther is always solid black. Usually in comic books, when they're trying to show some difference in shade, they usually use blue on black. I think this whole thing with the energy coursing through his costume is something they kind of introduced in the movies. But this figure here, it's clearly based on his comic book look, and yet it's got all this weird pink energy or pink tribal designs painted all over it. And it should be kind of stupid, but I think it looks kind of cool. However, I do have this Marvel Legend Black Panther figure. Now this is based on his movie look. It's a very nice figure, and it's pretty close to the comic book look. They didn't stray too far for this particular character. However, I am more of a comic book guy, and I did want a more comic accurate Black Panther. So I went out to some Boxing Day sales, and I found this guy for half price. So he was $14.99, and I thought, you know what, for that price, yeah, he's worth picking up. I really like the look of this figure. He's got this necklace here, which is a different piece. As far as accessories go, he had a couple of different hands. He's got two of these energy effects. So like you can put that right over his fist. So again, that adds to the fact that this is supposed to be pink energy kind of coursing through his costume, which he can release in these energy balls. So you can put both of these on his fists if I chose to display him with both fisted hands. And then kind of another odd accessory is he has a head which is not the same, it's very similar, except it doesn't have the pink energy effects, and it's got white eyes instead of the yellow eyes. So it's probably a more classic comic book look, but it does look a little odd on the pink body. So I prefer to display him with the pink mask. But yeah, so this isn't really a new figure. He's been out for a while, and you might have picked up one from Walmart when he was first released several months ago, but he's new to me, and I'm glad I snagged him. So next up, I've got another Marvel Legend. So this is the X-Force version of Deathlock. So you see here, Deathlock's got lots of nice sculpted detail in his face. He's got a rather ugly zombified mug there. And then for accessories, he's got a few cool guns. So he's got this one giant oversized gun that comes with this belt of bullets. He also has this smaller pistol, which can be holstered there on his side. And lastly, he came with this big shotgun type of thing as well. So more guns than he knows what to do with. So yeah, this is a really cool figure. Deathlock is one of those, like kind of, he's been around for quite some time, but I became familiar with him in the 90s when he got his own comic book series. Prior to that, he was always more of like a guest star or like a villain. And yeah, so I really loved that 90s version of Deathlock. And we got a pretty sweet figure of Deathlock in his more classic colors. in 2018. And this figure here, this made my best of list in 2018 because I thought it was just absolutely fantastic. I love everything about this figure. And I really didn't know if I was going to buy this one when it came out because it is the exact same figure. The only thing they've changed is the colors. He's got all the same weapons. Sculpting is exactly the same. Same backpack. You know. And this outfit here, the X-Force costume, it's a relatively new look for Deathlock since he joined one of the kind of spin-off X-Men teams. And I haven't read that series. I don't read a lot of X-Men books. I considered picking this one up just because Deathlock was in it, but I haven't done so as of yet. So I have no real connection to this look, and, you know, spending $30 on something just because it's a different color, you know, that can be a little tough. So this was basically the perfect Deathlock figure. I didn't think I was going to need this, but a week or so before Christmas, I was in EB Games. I saw this figure. They only had one of them there, and I already love this figure, so I didn't want to risk passing it up and then regretting it, so I went for it and picked it up, and I don't regret it at all because it is still pretty awesome. And in my mind, in order for me to have multiple versions of a figure, it helps if I can find some justification. And there have been 4 or 5 different like unique characters in the Marvel Universe that have been a Deathlock cyborg at one point or another. So even though this figure probably is not supposed to be the Michael Collins version of Deathlock, which is the 90s guy, but that's who I always imagined this to be. Whereas the Deathlock that's currently in X-Force, I know is not Michael Collins. I don't know much about the current Deathlock, but technically this would be a different character altogether, so that justifies having the 2 of them on my shelf. And yeah, as much as I loved it in 2018, I love it pretty much just as much in 2019. The translucent bullet belt is pretty cool. I don't know if that's something right from the comic, but it helps to differentiate the 2. And yeah, if you see this guy, I say definitely pick him up. So next up, I've got this Havoc and Polaris 2-pack. Now these guys are X-Men characters, although these particular figures are based on their looks for when they were part of one of the X-Men spin-off teams, X-Factor, during the 90s. So for you that aren't familiar with these characters, because they're not necessarily some of the more popular X-Men, but Havoc here, I wouldn't even know how to describe his powers. He's got some sort of plasma blasts. Essentially, he blasts energy from himself. And this guy is Cyclops' brother, Alex Summers. And then Polaris here, let's see, I think her name is Lorna Dane. She is Magneto's daughter, and she has magnetic powers similar to Magneto. And that's usually also portrayed using these similar kind of energy effects coming out of her hands. So both of these figures came with these energy effects that you can attach to their hands to kind of demonstrate their powers. Those were really the only accessories they came with, other than there was an extra set of hands for Polaris here, which I think were in fists as opposed to the open hands that she's got here. So I really like these figures. I like these looks for these characters, and I like the kind of the stylized nature to them. I wouldn't say they're necessarily based on the artist's artwork, as they're not quite as abstract as the artwork was during those years of X Factor, but you can clearly tell that it's influenced by it. Most notably, I would say, in Polaris's hair here, and the way it's kind of just strange. And I'd say that comes right from how it was drawn in the comic book at the time. I like this Havoc figure quite a bit. I think it does a really good job of, representing how this guy looked at this particular point in time in the 90s, with this kind of weird, I don't know what you call these things, head wrap, the way his kind of windblown hair kind of comes at the top, the way the jacket almost looks, makes his torso look disproportionate. Like he looks really top heavy there with kind of smaller legs. that's the way he was drawn, and I think they've done a really good job of recreating all of that. The only real gripe I have about this figure is these things here. So both his the cuffs on his boots, and then these kind of straps on his legs. Less so the straps on his legs, but you'll see here they're just loose, separate sculpted pieces, and they have a tendency to fall around. They don't stay where they're supposed to, and I understand why Hasbro does that. It allows them to reuse these kind of standard muscular male legs for all kinds of characters. Like you could use these legs for a Spider-Man figure, but by adding these as separate pieces, you know, it adds a little extra detail for Havoc. But I really wish they would glue these in place when they decide to use them and not leave it up to me to do that, because I really don't like how they're constantly falling down and make it look like he's got little anklets here. We had the same problem on the Cyclops figure, who had the same issue, and it's probably appeared on a few other figures as well that I can't really think of. Polaris has the same issue. She's got the little anklets, but they belong down there, so that's fine. Her belt slides around quite a bit, but it doesn't really matter either. I think it looks fine no matter where it's sitting. I actually really like this Polaris figure. I love the way it looks. She's got a very pretty sculpted face. The design, it's pretty simple. Like the costume is nothing to call home about, but it just looks really good. I like it a lot. For comparison purposes, let's bring in the older Havoc and Polaris figures. So this here is Havoc, looking quite a bit different in his X-Men outfit. And here is Polaris, and I guess we would call this her X-Men outfit as well. This is kind of her more classic look. Now, I like both of these figures as well. I'll always prefer this look for Havoc. It's the one I was, kind of introduced to him wearing. It's his original costume, except not quite. This figure kind of represents a modern take on his classic costume. The classic costume was just very stark black and white. The rings on his head were much more pronounced rather than being really tight to his face like that. They were big crazy rings, and the circle on his chest was white. He didn't have any accent for a belt or anything like that. So just the plain black and white Havoc is my preferred look for him, I guess. Although, to be honest, it is kind of silly looking, and both of these versions are probably better designs, even though they're all kind of silly in their own way. Now, Polaris, this is her classic costume. This is what I'm used to her wearing, but at the same time, it's a pretty bland costume as well. She kind of just looks like a green Scarlet Witch. She doesn't have any logo or any fancy belt. There's really nothing all that interesting about it, even though this was a good figure. But as opposed to where the Havocs, I kind of like them equally. I think the new Polaris is a big improvement, and this one has a lot more personality than this one does. So I'm glad I have them both. But if you have these older versions and you thought that was enough, I would recommend you actually do seek out this new pack. It's actually pretty great. So there you go, Havoc and Polaris. So next up, I've got a couple of Funko Pop figurines from the TV series The Umbrella Academy. So here's a closer look at Luther. You can see he's kind of a big, hefty guy. For where most Pops have kind of a smaller body, his is pretty large. And then you've got Klaus, who he's got lots of nice detail with his tattoos, including the Umbrella Academy logo. And he's got his little bottle of booze there. I like the leather pants there with the open sides, the feather boa. He's got his little dog tags around his neck. And I love the kind of the black makeup around his eyes too. It makes him look like a pretty sickly little individual. Anyway, these are both great figures. I'm hoping to get the rest of the Umbrella Academy before too long, but these are the first two that I came across. Now, if you're not familiar with the Umbrella Academy, it was a series that was on Netflix last year. I think there was maybe 8 or 10 episodes in total. I highly recommend it. I thought it was a lot of fun. But before it was a TV series, it was a comic book written by Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance. Now, not only am I a big My Chemical Romance fan, but I'm a big fan of Gerard Way's comic book work as well, because he's done a couple other series besides the Umbrella Academy. But Umbrella Academy remains my favorite thing that he's done, And they haven't made any action figures of the Umbrella Academy, but they did put out some kind of little figurines a while back, which I have. So you can see here, this is Klaus based on his comic book look. Now in the comic book, it's a little bit more superhero-y, so you can see he's got this kind of like more superhero outfit on, and they actually did have superhero names. So he went by the name Seance in the comic book. So there you go. And with Luther here, he was called Space Boy, and he has his head has been transplanted onto a big gorilla body. And, it's a really great look for this character. And I guess it just, budget-wise, it just wouldn't have worked to have him walking around like this in the TV show every episode. Would have been a lot of CG and all that stuff, I suppose. So, spoiler alert, but if you watch the show, he's walking around like this most of the time in just a big overcoat. And he looks a little oversized, a little padded, but you think maybe he just works out. It's kind of revealed in like the second to last episode, I think, that he actually does have a gorilla body, but it's definitely not as extreme in size as this here, as it appears in the comic book. But anyway, I love these characters. I love the comic book. I love the show. I love Funko Pops. And I was happy to add these guys to my collection. And if you're a fan of the Umbrella Academy, I suggest you seek them out as well. So next up is the Decepticon Shockwave. Now, I'm a pretty serious Transformer collector. I buy most of the Generation 1 Transformers that Hasbro puts out. And I usually know what's coming months in advance. Anyway, while we were Christmas shopping, me and my brother, we went into Toys R Us. And I saw this series of Transformers that I had never seen before and had no idea what it was. And this was one of them. So they are inspired by the Generation 1 look of Transformers. As you saw from the pictures of the sealed box that I showed you a second ago, there was no window on the box, so I couldn't really see what the actual toy looked like. I was just judging by the picture on the front of the box. And it looked like it was kind of geared towards kids. And if you take a look at the back, like you'll see it's got a lot of these hollow spots, which is usually indicative of kind of a cheaper, maybe kiddier version of Transformers. But the look of him, he looked like such a classic Generation 1 Shockwave that it was kind of exactly what I was looking for. I love the look of this figure. I love the colors. And yeah, he was $20, but all the Transformers were discounted by like 25%. So yeah, I got this guy for $15. And size-wise, like he's probably about 6 or 7 inches. Like he's a good size. Like I said, he's got some good articulation, or basic articulation there, in that his arms turn up and down. He's got his elbows there. His head spins. The only real flaw there is that he doesn't have any bends at the knee. You can see there that joint doesn't move, so his legs are pretty stiff. He does have some articulation at the feet there, though. And his legs spread apart and everything, so you can put him in some poses. For $15, this is an awesome Shockwave figure. And I don't know how I totally missed that these figures were coming out. Now, I had the vintage Shockwave figure when I was a kid. I absolutely loved it. It was like really big in size. It had some of that like metal parts, so he felt heavy. He was really cool, but unfortunately I got rid of pretty much all of my Transformers when I was 13, 14 years old, and I regret getting rid of them all. And Shockwave is one of the ones I regret getting rid of the most, because that was such a cool figure. And since I've been collecting Transformers as an adult collector, I've been trying to get the most iconic versions of those original Transformers that I can get. Not necessarily going back and rebuying the old ones, because even the ones that looked really good, I found those vintage toys were a little stiff, and I always wanted something a little better, which is partly why I was able to part with them when I was a tween, rather than holding on to them like I did with my G.I. Joes and Battle Beasts and things. But the Transformers, even the good ones, I thought they could have been a little better. And in the last 10 years or so, I have gotten awesome versions of pretty much every Transformer I would want, except Shockwave. He's been one of these guys that they just haven't quite seemed to get right. Like, you can buy masterpiece versions of him, which are like $200, and they look pretty close to, what I would want. But I want something that's more reasonably priced. Now, the current line of Transformers being put out by Hasbro is called Siege, and they're doing a really good job of putting out some really nice figures for pretty reasonable prices. But Shockwave, they put him out earlier in 2019, and here's the Siege version of Shockwave. And this guy is pretty good. He's a little darker purple than I would like. He loses some of the detail. This light piping on his eye, it looks good right now because the light from my lamp is shining through, so his eyes got kind of a glow. But when he's on my shelf and, you can't really see, his eye kind of gets lost there. And look at how big he is. This guy is shorter than this guy. So I'd say he's about 5 inches tall, almost 6. But this thing was $60. And they justified charging me that much by adding some extra snap-on accessories that I really didn't need. That made him a little taller and gave him some extra arms and all kinds of silly stuff. But I just want a classic Shockwave. And the fact that this guy was $15 and this guy was $60 just seems crazy to me. Because this guy here is in a lot of ways superior to this guy here. Next up, I've got this bad boy. Now, I had one of these when I was a kid, and I'm pretty sure that they were called Scout Walkers back then. I don't know if they had the designation ATST, which is what they're called now. Sometimes they're referred to as Imperial Walkers. But anyway, the one I had as a kid was from the Return of the Jedi toy line, as I'm pretty sure that's the first movie that these things appeared in. So Empire Strikes Back gave us the AT-AT, which everybody just referred to as the AT-AT. And then, Jedi gave us the AT-ST, which I don't think I've ever heard anybody try and pronounce it the AT-ST or whatever. So, Scout Walker was the name that they gave it, or Imperial Walker. So I don't buy 3 3/4 inch Star Wars figures. I kind of vowed to stop buying them like a decade or more ago because I had so many of them and I was buying the same characters over and over again. But every once in a blue moon, I will pick one up when I see one that's like really cool or really cheap. And this thing here, I was shopping online for my brother's Christmas present at Big Bad Toy Store, and they had this vehicle here, which was usually $60, and they had it on for $20, and I couldn't resist. I kind of had forgotten how much I loved this thing when I was a kid. This was kind of really, I think, my only Star Wars vehicle. My brother Doug had a few additional ones, but yeah, I don't really think I had any. I had Jabba's, like the Jabba the Hutt's throne room accessory, and I had this thing, and that was pretty much it that I had that weren't just figures. And this thing was great. The one I had as a kid, there was a button on the back that you pressed right here, and when you pressed it, his legs would stomp up and down, which was really cool. This one here, I don't know if it's supposed to still be based on Return of the Jedi. I believe it is. But it's got this kind of interesting paint job in that it almost barely doesn't have a paint job. It's pretty much just molded in gray plastic. But then it's got this kind of like muddy, weathered look. So it's got this kind of brown, yellow paint kind of splashed over it. And I haven't decided yet if I like it or not. If it was just solid gray, it might look a little cheap. So I guess I appreciate that Hasbro added a little bit of weathering. But now it just kind of looks old and dirty. And I might prefer it if it was just clean. Anyway, so this version here, you'll see it's got this turret on the front that moves around a little bit. He's got weapons on both sides of his head that can be spun around. He's got these little windows here which can be closed down on the front. And he's got this little thing on the top that you can close down too once you put your pilot inside. It's got some good movement. It's kind of hard for me to show you right now because I'm holding my tablet with my other hand. But the head spins around, the legs go up and down. Here, let me just set this thing down for a second. So yeah, the movement with the legs. Okay, well there's a little bit of extra movement there. One thing that my old toy did not do when I was a kid is the legs come out really far like this. So that's a new feature, and you can get kind of a weird spidery look to this thing. It's just really cool. And for 20 bucks, it's absolutely worth it. I'm really happy to have one of these things back in my collection again. And it came with a pilot too, which was pretty cool. So here is the Walker pilot. And I imagine that you could get this figure in the vintage 80s Star Wars line. I don't remember off the top of my head. I certainly didn't have it when I was a kid. And my Scout Walker, it didn't come with a pilot. I think I just had to put a Stormtrooper or whatever inside of him to pilot it. But in the 90s, I didn't own a Scout Walker, but I did own the Scout Walker pilot, who was sold as an individual character. And so you can see here, this is a figure from the late 90s. And this new figure here is vastly superior to this one. Not only is it more detailed, he comes with an accessory, which this guy probably didn't come with a handgun. His articulation is so he's actually got knees that bend and elbows that bend, which none of the vintage Star Wars figures had, and most of the ones in the 90s didn't have either. So good range of movement. And on top of all that, his helmet comes off, which is pretty cool. So then you've got a unique character sculpt underneath. So this guy is all just, he's the cherry on top of a really cool vehicle. And it's cool to get a nice little pilot with it as well. So next up, I've got a couple of Star Wars Black Series figures. So I've got Lando Calrissian and Clone Commander Rex. Now, I also ordered these guys from Big Bad Toy Store in the same order as my Scout Walker and my brother's Christmas present. And these were figures that Big Bad have had on for, several months. Some of these maybe even a couple of years. And I've considered buying them, but I never pulled the trigger. But then they were both marked down for their Christmas sale. And so I finally took the plunge. And I'm glad I did, as they're both really cool figures. And I'm really impressed with this Lando. I like Lando as a character, but when I started collecting Black Series, I kind of decided I wasn't going to buy all the standard human characters. As I mentioned to you a second ago, I stopped collecting the 3 3/4 inch Star Wars figures because I'd collected them for so many years. And when the prequels were coming out in the 90s and the early 2000s, I just got kind of burnt out on Star Wars. And I have so many versions of all the main characters, like dozens of Lukes and Hans and Obi-Wans, that when I started buying Black Series, even though they're really cool and really detailed, I did not want to buy all the same characters again. So I said I was going to stick to just buying aliens and robots and cool things like that. So when Lando came out, there's 2 Lando figures that came out right around the same time. There was this one here, and there was also him in his more standard blue outfit with a cape. And I didn't get either one of them. But I've always had a fondness for this look. I think it's a cool looking character. And seeing this helmet kind of brought out again in Solo was pretty cool. So I forget what it was on sale for, but it was probably half price or so. And yeah, it's really cool. I like everything about the design here. And the removable helmet reveals a pretty nice likeness to Billy D. Williams. And yeah, so a really cool figure. There we are. And besides, I did actually pick up this young Lando figure from the Solo movie line. And this was kind of an impulse buy just because I was kind of excited about a new Star Wars movie at the time. And while I think this guy did a good job with Han Solo, I couldn't have this, as he did a good job as Lando in Solo, I couldn't have this be the only Lando in my collection because as good as he was, he's no Billy D. So if I'm going to have him, I had to have at least one Billy D in my collection. And so yeah, that's why I picked him up. As for Clone Commander Rex, so he is one of the, the clone commanders from the Clone Wars era, which is not an era I have a ton of fondness for. I've watched all the movies, but I did not watch the Clone Wars cartoons. And that's where the clone troopers and the clone commanders really shone, I guess. Is that the right word? Really shone? That's where they really came into popularity. I understand a lot of these clone commanders were kind of made to be unique characters, but I kind of missed out on all that. So I don't really have any particular fondness for this character. And truth be told, I've acquired quite a lot of Stormtrooper and Clone Trooper Commander variations in the last few years. that I've kind of lost my excitement for them. So you see here, these are all the clone commanders that I've picked up in the last little while. And a lot of them share a lot of similarities. So while I think Clone Commander Rex was actually the first one they put out, I had never seen this in stores. If I had, I probably would have bought it. But I had seen it for sale on online at Big Bad Toy Store, and I just never really pulled the trigger on it. And then every time I encountered one of these other clone commanders in a store and I would buy them, it made this guy seem all that much less important because I had so many other figures that were so close to him. But what really made me finally, go ahead and purchase this guy was that he's got a feature none of the other guys have, which is the removable helmet. So you can take this helmet off of him, and he's got the face of Jango Fett, that's who all these clone troopers are clones of. So that's pretty cool. And I do have a Jango Fett figure. I don't know if it's the exact same head underneath. I'm sure the hair is different because Rex here has got the bleach blonde look, which Jango never did. But let's take a look if it's actually the exact same head. Okay, so here's my Jango Fett figure. And if we pop that off, nope. They actually look like they're different sculpts. I think this one is quite a bit better. You can see they're using the face scanning technology. This looks a lot more like the actor than this one does. But I can see similarities. And yeah, I would believe that this guy was a clone of that guy. So the fact that his helmet comes off is the real selling point of this figure. And it is a really good figure besides. I like that it's got some of these soft goods here. He's got the 2 pistols that can be holstered there. I like the look of the blue and the white. It looks really good. I don't love this little paint error here on his forehead, but whatever. Anyway, cool figure. And if you want to fill in your clone trooper armies, then yeah, snag this guy. So that's all my new purchases for the past month or so. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me comments below. I'm always happy to get your comments, and I try to reply to every one of them. So yeah, hopefully I hear from you. And I will be back in another week or so with another video. So until then, thanks for watching.